The words landed before anyone was ready for them. Not because they came without warning. Not because the signs hadn't been there, visible to anyone paying close enough attention over the last several weeks. Not because the baseball world hadn't been quietly bracing for some version of this conversation. But because hearing Dave Roberts say them out loud, clearly, without hesitation, without the cushioning language that managers typically use when delivering difficult news, made everything suddenly and irreversibly real. We can't go any further. 6 words. Spoken into a microphone in a press conference room that had heard 1,000 announcements over the years. Routine roster moves. Injury updates. Strategic explanations delivered with the careful neutrality of organizational messaging. But these 6 words were none of those things. These 6 words carried the particular weight of a decision that had been wrestled with, argued over, slept on, and ultimately arrived at through the painful process of choosing between what you want and what you know is necessary. And what they meant for Shohei Ohtani sent shockwaves through the baseball world that are still being felt. The press conference had been called with less than 2 hours' notice. That alone was enough to signal that something significant was coming. Routine announcements don't require urgency. Routine announcements get folded into the natural rhythm of the media schedule. When Dave Roberts personally requested an availability outside of the normal timing, when the Dodgers communications staff began notifying reporters with the particular terseness that accompanies serious news, the speculation started immediately and spread fast. Was it an injury? A trade? Something involving the roster that went beyond the ordinary adjustments of a long season? Nobody knew. And in the space between not knowing and finding out, every possibility was entertained. Every scenario was constructed and dismantled and reconstructed by the people whose job it was to anticipate exactly these kinds of moments. Roberts walked into the room and the speculation stopped. Because his face answered most of the questions before his mouth did. There was no performance in his expression. No careful management of how he was presenting himself to the assembled media. He looked like a man who had made a decision he believed in completely and was grieving it anyway. Which is perhaps the most honest thing a person can look like. Which is perhaps the most difficult emotional combination a manager ever has to carry into a room full of people waiting to broadcast his words to the world. He sat down. He adjusted the microphone. He looked at the reporters in front of him with the directness of someone who had decided that what he was about to say deserved to be delivered without softness or deflection. Then he said it. We've made a decision regarding Shohei that I know is going to be difficult to hear. We've looked at everything. We've consulted with our medical staff, with our front office, with Shohei himself. And we've concluded that we can't go any further with the current approach. Something has to change. And it has to change now. The room was immediately electric with the particular tension of journalists who have a story and need more of it. Questions came from multiple directions at once, overlapping, urgent. Roberts raised his hand with the patience of someone who had anticipated exactly this reaction. I'm going to explain everything, he said. But I need you to hear it the way we arrived at it. Not as a sudden decision. As the conclusion of a process that we've been working through very carefully. What followed was the kind of explanation that reveals how much happens inside a baseball organization that never reaches the public. The conversations that occur in medical offices and managers' offices and boardrooms. The daily assessments that are conducted, documented, discussed, and ultimately fed into decisions that look simple from the outside but contain multitudes of complexity within them. Roberts explained that the organization had been monitoring Ohtani's workload with increasing concern over the preceding weeks. Not because Ohtani had complained. Not because his performance had dropped in any visible way. But because the people whose job was to look beneath the surface of performance, to track the biological and physical data that doesn't show up in batting averages or ERA, had been seeing things that demanded a response. Ohtani had been doing too much. Not in the way that sounds like a complaint. In the way that sounds like a warning. His body had been operating at a level that even the most advanced athletic preparation cannot sustain indefinitely. The two-way demands, which had always been extraordinary, had begun accumulating in ways that the medical staff could measure and quantify and present to Roberts as a pattern requiring intervention. "Shohei will do anything we ask," Roberts said, and the simplicity of that statement contained an enormous amount of meaning. That's part of what makes this so hard. He doesn't have an off switch. He doesn't know how to give less than everything. And in most situations, that quality is exactly what you want from your best player. But there are moments when that quality becomes the thing you have to protect him from. He paused, and you could see him choosing his next words with extraordinary care. We can't go any further asking him to be everything simultaneously. Something has to be prioritized. And we've made that decision. The specific details of what that decision meant for Ohtani's immediate role came out gradually through the subsequent questions, and each answer added another layer to a story that was already sitting heavily in the room. There would be a structured reduction in his pitching schedule. The two-way demands that had defined his season and captured the imagination of the baseball world would be managed more conservatively going forward. The Dodgers were making a calculated choice to protect October by placing boundaries on what they asked of him between now and then. For a player who had already hit 21 home runs. For a player who had been the central figure in moments that defined this franchise's season narrative. For a player who had handed his home run bat to an opposing manager and smiled at a ball boy when he thought no one was watching and stood on mounds and in batters' boxes simultaneously in ways that made legendary pitchers furious and crowds unable to stop cheering, the idea of limitation felt almost philosophically incompatible with who he was. And yet here was Dave Roberts, saying it out loud in a room full of reporters, because the alternative was a risk nobody in the organization was willing to take. When a reporter asked Roberts how Ohtani had responded when the decision was presented to him, the manager was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. And then he said something that traveled from that press conference room all the way to the center of every conversation being had about this decision across the baseball world. He said he understood, Roberts said. He said he trusted us. And then he said something I'm going to remember for a long time. Another pause. He said, the goal isn't the regular season. The goal is what comes after it. The shockwaves were immediate and enormous and came from every direction simultaneously. Former players who understood the physical reality of what Ohtani had been doing expressed a complicated mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the organization was being responsible. Sorrow that the most extraordinary individual performance in recent baseball memory was being structurally contained, even for the best possible reasons. Analysts debated the timing and the implications and the specific contours of what this meant for the Dodgers' competitive position in the weeks ahead. Fans processed it with the particular emotional complexity of people who love something and are being asked to accept less of it for reasons they understand but still resist. And somewhere inside the Dodgers organization, Shohei Ohtani was preparing for a version of this season that looked slightly different from the one that had already been written. A version with managed edges and protected limits and the kind of careful stewardship that comes from an organization that had decided winning in October mattered more than anything that could happen before it. Roberts ended the press conference with the quietness of someone who had said everything that needed to be said and had nothing left to perform. We made this decision because we believe in what this team can accomplish, he said. And protecting Shohei is the foundation of that belief. Not a limitation of it. He stood up. Gathered his notes. Looked briefly at the room. We can't go any further with the old approach, he said one final time. But we can go a lot further with the right one. And then he walked out into the particular silence of a baseball world that was still catching its breath.